in July of 1987, on a road just outside Mason County, Kentucky. 3 grain trucks rolled through the morning fog and stopped in front of a collapsing wooden gate that hadn't been painted in 20 years. The drivers stepped out laughing before the engines even died. One of them kicked open the trailer hatch, and spoiled wheat poured into the dirt like muddy water. Wet grain, molded grain. Grain already written off by Mid-South Grain Company as worthless waste. And standing beside that old gate was Elias Boone. He wore a faded denim jacket darkened by grease stains and years of sun. His boots were cracked at the sides. His farm looked more abandoned than alive. The barn leaned slightly east from an old storm back in 1974, and the rusted grain dryer beside it looked like something left behind after the war. The men from Mid-South could barely stop laughing. Thought we'd save the county dump a trip. One driver shouted. Another pointed toward Elias's barn. Hell, this place already smells like rotten grain anyway. Then Warren Doyle himself stepped out of a black Cadillac parked behind the trucks. Owner of Mid-South Grain, 42 years old, silk tie, polished boots. A man who had built the biggest grain storage operation in 3 counties and never let anyone forget it. He looked at the old farmer for a long moment before smiling. You still fixing dead machines out here? Boone, he asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. Maybe dead grain belongs with dead equipment. The drivers burst out laughing again, but Elias never answered. He simply walked toward the pile, crouched slowly, and picked up a handful of wet wheat. He rubbed the kernels between his fingers, the way some men examine gold dust in river water. Quiet, focused, like the insults around him had nothing to do with him at all. That was the part people remembered later, because while everyone else saw garbage, Elias Boone looked at that grain like he saw something worth saving, and nobody in Mason County understood why. By the next afternoon, the whole town was talking about it. At Rosie's Diner near Highway 11, farmers laughed into their coffee cups about old Elias eating mold for supper. Teenagers drove past his property after dark and tossed handfuls of rotten grain at his mailbox. Someone even nailed a wooden sign to his fence that read, "Boone's feedlot for dead crops." Nobody admitted doing it, but everybody laughed when they saw it. The truth was, Mason County had stopped respecting men like Elias a long time ago. The world was changing. Farming was changing. Big companies had replaced family storage barns. Computers tracked moisture levels now. Steel silos towered over fields where old wooden grain houses once stood. Men in pressed shirts and clean trucks talked about efficiency, while small farmers disappeared one season at a time. And Elias Boone looked like the last shadow of a dying world. The bank already held 2 liens against his property. Most people believed foreclosure was only months away. His corn yield had been poor for 3 straight summers. His tractors were older than some of the men mocking him, and every morning before sunrise, he could still be seen repairing ancient belts and pulleys beside that rusted grain dryer everyone in town called the Dinosaur. Warren Doyle loved reminding people of it. A week after dumping the spoiled grain, he hosted a public barbecue outside the new Mid-South storage facility. Nearly half the county showed up. There were banners hanging from the steel silos that read, "The Future of American Farming." Country music echoed across the lot, while workers gave tours of the automated drying systems worth millions of dollars. And sometime around sunset, Warren stood near the beer coolers telling a group of local reporters about old-fashioned farmers refusing to adapt. Then somebody asked him about Elias Boone. Warren laughed before taking a slow sip from his bottle. "That old man," he said. "Elias Boone would rather sleep beside rotten wheat than admit his time's over." The crowd laughed hard at that one, but there was something nobody in that parking lot knew. Every single night while the town laughed at him, lights still burned inside Elias Boone's barn until nearly dawn, and the old man never stopped working. What most people in Mason County had forgotten was that Elias Boone came from a family that survived things modern men only read about in history books. His father, Samuel Boone, had repaired military grain dryers during World War II at a supply depot outside Louisville. Back then, spoiled grain could mean soldiers starving overseas. Samuel used to say there was a difference between dead grain and damaged grain, and most men were too impatient to learn the difference. Elias grew up listening to those lessons inside hot machine sheds filled with diesel smoke and metal dust. He learned how moisture traveled through kernels, how heat could save grain or destroy it, how fast drying made companies rich, and how slow drying kept families alive. But this story was never really about grain alone. It was about what happens when knowledge gets mistaken for poverty, after Samuel Boone died in the winter of 1968. Elias inherited the old dryer everyone mocked. Most people thought it belonged in a scrapyard. What they did not know was that Samuel had secretly modified the machine for nearly 15 years. Extra chambers hidden behind the steel panels, hand-built airflow controls, a slower rotating heat drum designed not for speed, but preservation. No patent was ever filed. No company ever bought it. And Samuel Boone never told more than one person how it truly worked: his son. That machine sitting beside Elias's barn was not just old equipment. It was a quiet piece of wartime engineering built by a man who understood hunger better than businessmen ever would. And before long, Mason County was about to learn the difference the hard way. August arrived carrying a kind of heat Mason County had not seen in decades. By the second week of the month, fence posts cracked from dryness. Creeks shrank into muddy trenches. Corn leaves curled inward like paper held too close to fire. Even the cattle moved slower beneath the dead afternoon sun, gathering near empty troughs as if they already sensed something bad coming. Every radio station in Kentucky started using the same word: shortage. At first, nobody panicked. Men like Warren Doyle made sure of that. Mid-South Grain released newspaper ads showing their massive steel silos standing full beneath bright blue skies. Warren appeared on local television wearing rolled-up sleeves and a confident smile, promising the county that modern storage systems could withstand anything nature delivered. "We're prepared for this," he said during one interview outside the facility. That's the difference between progress and old-fashioned guesswork. Everyone knew who he meant. And while Warren Doyle stood beneath television cameras talking about the future, Elias Boone kept working alone behind the walls of his leaning barn. Night after night, smoke drifted from the pipe above the old grain dryer. Some evenings, people driving Highway 11 could hear the machine groaning through the darkness like a distant locomotive. The sound carried across the fields long after midnight, belts turning, fans humming, steel rattling under heat, and still, nobody understood why Elias was working so hard to save grain everyone else had already abandoned. But there was one person who started paying attention: a 14-year-old newspaper boy named Caleb Turner. Every morning before school, Caleb rode his bicycle past Boone's property delivering papers across the county. Most days, Elias barely looked up from his work. But one morning, near sunrise, Caleb noticed something strange. The side panel of the old dryer had been removed. Inside the machine was a second layer of equipment hidden beneath the rusted outer shell. Copper tubing, pressure gauges, hand-built airflow valves unlike anything Caleb had seen before. It looked less like farm equipment and more like something pulled from an old Navy ship. Elias noticed the boy staring for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. Then Elias quietly slid the panel back into place. "My father built part of it during the war," he said. Caleb frowned. "Why hide it?" Elias wiped grease from his hands with an old rag before answering. "Because fast money ruins good ideas." That was all he said. But the words stayed with Caleb long after he rode away. And the deeper Mason County fell into drought, the stranger things began to feel. 3 weeks later, the first real signs of trouble appeared at Mid-South Grain. One of the cooling systems inside the company's main storage facility failed during a 98-degree afternoon. At first, workers thought it was minor, a backup fan malfunction, nothing serious. But heat trapped inside grain silos behaves like fire trapped inside walls. Moisture builds silently, pressure rises slowly, and by the time the smell appears, the damage has already begun. Workers arriving before dawn started noticing sour air near the east storage row. Then came condensation dripping down the inner steel walls. Then came entire pockets of fermented grain turning hot enough to steam in the morning air. Mid-South managers tried hiding it. Truckloads moved at night. Security tightened around the facility. Employees were warned not to speak to reporters. But in small farming towns, secrets rot faster than grain. Within days, rumors spread everywhere. Rosie's Diner stopped serving free bread baskets. because flour deliveries were delayed. Grocery stores started limiting rice, oats, and wheat products. Farmers lined up outside feed suppliers only to find prices doubling almost overnight. And still Warren Doyle refused to admit anything publicly. Instead, he doubled down. During a county agriculture meeting in late August, he stood before nearly 100 farmers and blamed the shortages on temporary transportation problems. Then, as if he could not help himself, he looked directly toward Elias Boone sitting quietly near the back wall. "You know what destroys farming faster than drought," Warren said with a grin. People clinging to dead ideas. A few nervous laughs rolled through the room, but they were quieter this time, because something had changed in the air. The county had started noticing that Elias Boone never looked worried, not once. While everyone else panicked over shrinking supplies, Elias continued moving slowly and calmly through town in his old Ford pickup. He still bought the same coffee at Miller's gas station every Thursday morning, still repaired broken belts behind his barn, still worked until dawn beside the old dryer. And every week, more grain sacks appeared inside his storage shed. Nobody knew how many. Nobody knew what condition they were really in. But whispers started spreading that Elias Boone might have been preparing for this long before anyone else saw it coming. Then came the day everything got worse. On September 3rd, 1987, an early evening storm rolled across northern Kentucky with winds strong enough to tear trees from shallow ground. Rain hammered the county for 6 straight hours. Near midnight, flooding collapsed a section of Route 17 just outside Mason County, the main transportation road used for commercial grain deliveries into the region. By sunrise, supply trucks stopped completely. No flour, no feed, no emergency shipments. The county was suddenly trapped with whatever food remained inside its borders. And that was the moment fear finally became real. People rushed stores before breakfast. Shelves emptied before noon. Arguments broke out over bags of cornmeal and flour. Meanwhile, inside the Mid-South facility, entire storage sections had already spoiled beyond recovery. What happened next became the part nobody in Mason County ever forgot. Because while the county searched desperately for food, a quiet old farmer sitting behind a collapsing wooden gate had already spent months saving what everybody else threw away. The first people to arrive at Elias Boone's property were not reporters or politicians. They were mothers, women carrying empty flour bags in the back seats of old station wagons, elderly couples who had lived through rationing years earlier in their lives, small cattle farmers whose feed bins were almost empty. They came quietly at first, parking along the gravel road outside the Boone farm sometime before sunrise. Nobody knew exactly who started the rumor, only that someone had seen grain sacks stacked inside Elias's barn from floor to ceiling. By mid-morning, trucks lined both sides of the road, and still, Elias Boone said almost nothing. He moved slowly through the crowd beneath the pale September sun, unlocking the heavy doors of his storage shed while people watched in complete silence. The hinges groaned open. Then the entire county saw what had been hidden inside. Rows upon rows of grain sacks. Clean sacks, dry sacks, thousands of pounds of wheat stacked carefully atop wooden pallets. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The same people who once laughed at him now stared like they were looking at something impossible. One of the local bakers stepped forward first. He cut open a sack with a pocket knife and buried his hand deep inside the grain. His eyes widened immediately. "It's good," he whispered. Another farmer grabbed a handful and checked the kernels against the light. Not moldy, not fermented, not rotten. Good grain. Better than good. The wheat smelled fresh. That was the moment fear inside Mason County changed into something else entirely. Disbelief. Because none of it made sense. Mid-South Grain had multi-million-dollar drying systems, climate-controlled silos, computerized moisture monitoring, entire engineering teams. And yet the old man everyone mocked had somehow preserved more usable grain than the largest company in the region. But Elias still did not celebrate. He simply looked across the crowd and said something few people expected. "Families first," he said quietly. "No speeches, no revenge, no boasting. Families first. The elderly, the bakeries, the farms with children." Word spread through the county faster than wildfire. By noon, local deputies arrived to manage traffic outside the Boone property. Church volunteers began organizing food distribution tables beside the barn. Pickup trucks loaded with grain rolled out toward nearby towns before sunset. And standing at the edge of it all, watching his reputation collapse in real time, was Warren Doyle. He arrived in the same black Cadillac people once admired, only this time, nobody gathered around him. Nobody asked for interviews. Nobody cared what he had to say. He walked through the crowd in polished boots, coated now with dust and mud, his face pale beneath the afternoon heat. For the first time since anyone could remember, Warren Doyle looked uncertain. Then he saw the grain, real grain. Dry, stable, usable. He walked directly toward Elias. "You selling?" Warren asked quietly. Elias kept tying shut another sack. "You heard me." Warren snapped louder. "Name your price." People nearby stopped moving. Everyone could feel the tension settling into the air, because this was the moment many had secretly waited for. The powerful man begging the old farmer he once humiliated. But Elias Boone never looked angry. That was what unsettled Warren most. "There's enough here to save your company." Warren continued. "I can move it across 3 counties. We can make a deal." Elias finally looked up, and for a second, the entire crowd fell silent. Then the old farmer said the words Warren Doyle would remember for the rest of his life. "This grain already has owners." Warren frowned. "What are you talking about?" Elias glanced toward the waiting families beside the barn. "The people you forgot. Nobody moved after that. Not the deputies. Not the workers. Not even the reporters arriving from Lexington." The silence itself became heavier than shouting, because everyone standing there understood what had really happened. Warren Doyle had built his empire around volume, speed, and profit. Elias Boone had built his life around survival, and survival was slower, harder, less glamorous. But when disaster finally came, survival was the thing that mattered. Later that evening, a young agricultural engineer sent by the state arrived to inspect Boone's grain supplies. His name was Daniel Mercer, fresh out of Purdue University, the kind of man who trusted charts more than instinct. At first, he clearly expected to expose some mistake, but after 2 hours inside the barn, his expression completely changed. He examined moisture levels 3 separate times, checked internal temperatures, split kernels beneath portable lights. Finally, he walked back outside carrying a sample bag in stunned silence. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered. Reporters immediately crowded around him. Daniel hesitated before answering. "The grain quality coming out of this barn," he said slowly, "is actually more stable than most modern commercial storage." The crowd erupted into confused voices. Then Daniel said something even more shocking. Whoever designed that drying system understood low heat preservation decades ahead of commercial standards. Every eye turned toward Elias Boone, but the old farmer simply looked toward the barn, where the machine still hummed softly in the dark. And for the first time in years, people stopped seeing it as junk. What happened afterwards spread far beyond Mason County. State investigators launched inspections into Mid-South grain within weeks. Internal documents revealed that Warren Doyle's company had ignored repeated warnings about overheating risks inside their high-speed storage systems. Maintenance budgets had been cut to increase quarterly profits. Workers had raised concerns months earlier and were ignored. By winter, Mid-South lost its largest contracts. Warren Doyle disappeared from public view not long after. Some said he moved to Nashville. Others claimed he sold what remained of the company to outside investors. Nobody knew for certain, and strangely enough, Elias Boone never spoke about him again. That was the part people remembered most, after everything that had happened, after the humiliation, after being laughed at in front of the entire county. Elias never once tried to embarrass the man back. Instead, he kept doing exactly what he had always done. He repaired engines behind the barn, shared seed with struggling farmers, helped rebuild feed supplies before winter arrived. Every Thursday morning, he still stopped at Miller's gas station for coffee before